So, wow, questions. I'll start at the back. There and then there. Please shout out your question if you haven't got a mic.
That's fine. I just had a question about related to Graham Turner's last presentation. A lot of us would like to work shorter hours for the same income, or even less income to consume less, but there's sort of a business dynamic and a sort of social pressure to keep working the same or more hours. What are the mechanisms that we're going to be able to convert increased productivity or economic surplus into more leisure time as opposed to more consumption of goods? Do we have to go down the pathway that some European countries have gone and mandating certain working week like the French? See other European countries mandating that they having less working hours for the same sort of caliber of income. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Is it going to be education, social pressure, the role of unions, the role of government, and so on?
Thank you. Who would like to have first go at that?
Not me.
Good answer.
Okay, the question is how do we realistically get to a shorter working week, like a 3-day week? The most obvious answer is government legislation, because from the point of view of any individual employer, it's much better to work 50 people for 50 hours a week and 100 people for 25 hours a week. There's less management expense and so on. I think employers ought to be attracted to the change, because a shorter working week means people are more productive. It's one of the things that went largely unreported, but I was in the UK when Edward Heath took on the mining unions and basically closed down manufacturing in Britain. There was a miners' strike that meant they were short of electricity, and they put all of British industry on a 3-day week to ration the electricity that was available. What was largely unreported is that there was almost no loss in production. The industry was on a 3-day week rather than a 5-day week. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if you look at things like records for different distances for running or swimming or cycling, the longer you have to go, the slower you have to perform to maintain just to keep going. You can't keep going at the same pace for a longer period. And people actually work more productively if they have shorter weeks. So I think it ought to be attractive to the community, and if we had rational governments, it ought to be attractive to them, to say that rather than having 5% of Australians unemployed and probably 15% underemployed, we should be steadily legislating to reduce the working week and get those people into productive part-time work, which would be better for them as individuals and better for the community.
Just to add to that, I looked at the average hours per worker recently, and it has been decreasing in Australia anyway. So something's happening already, and I know that probably comes along with less secure work, but it is increasingly more accessible to part-time work.
If there was no loss of production, I wonder what that does to Graham Turner's model, steady state. Okay, up the back.
We've heard scenarios from Canada, Europe and Australia to reach a steady state economy. But if we factor in the whole world, then the rich countries are going to have to decrease their consumption by somewhere between a factor of 2 and 4 below business as usual. So my question is how is that going to work out in the future?
Well, the positive thing in response to that, there's a lot of fat in some economies. I know the one I flew over from, you have artificial waterfalls in Las Vegas, and I can't go without mentioning the Hummers again, but NASCAR, there's crazy stuff that can be trimmed out of an economy, and so it makes it much less draconian sounding to lower the total consumption. But it's still not saying it would be easy by any means, or likely, as Graham pointed out, but not as bad maybe as it might seem to get that done. There's no doubt that it's it's physically possible. I mean, it's absurd that Australia now has the largest new houses of any country in the planet, even grosser than Ryan's country, 220 square metres on average, occupied by 1.8 people. I mean, it's bizarre. But I think what it goes back to is one of the points that Molly Scott Cato made. And this is why I think growth appeals to politicians, even if they haven't got business in their ear or in their pockets. She said, as long as there is growth, there is hope, and that makes inequality defensible. As long as there is growth, you can say to the poorest, yes, you're desperately poor, but you're not quite as desperately poor as you were last year, so you shouldn't be looking enviously at James Packer lighting his cigars with $100 notes. Factor in 100 years of economic growth and you'll be lighting cigars with $100 notes. If there is no growth, then the much more difficult political issue of redistribution has to be tackled, both within countries and between countries. Now, it seems to me obvious that if civilization has a future, the difficult task of redistribution has to be tackled, because it's impossible to pretend that there is any capacity for efficiency improvement that allows 7 billion or 9 billion people to live like Australians or Americans do today. The only model that works, that allows populations to survive within the limits of natural systems, is a contract and converge model, in which the rich countries slim down their consumption to allow the poorest of the world to have clean water and adequate nutrition and reasonable shelter and basic health care. It seems to me that's obvious from the sums, and it's politically very difficult, because not many politicians are going to say, vote for me and I will guarantee to reduce your material consumption over the next term of office. But if we're realistic about the task of accommodating 7 or 9 billion people on a finite planet, then we have to tackle redistribution both within and between communities.
Okay, I'd like to get someone who hasn't asked questions ever.
I was wondering whether it's worth be valuable to be more discriminatory about the type of economy that you're looking at. There's some types of economies, particularly service industries, which have got very low or even no environmental impact. For instance, caring for the environment to start off with. You've got education, you've got information services, you've got human services, all very low or no economic impact. We can be looking for growth in those services, and so we don't need to be locked into a no growth philosophy. We can be more selective, and whether we can come to better conclusions with those sorts of analysis. Also being more selective about clear about what sort of economy we're talking about. We're talking about GDP, which is all about finance. There's a lot of non-financial economy that we can be talking about too.
Could I stop you there? Because I think that's plenty of the help.
Yeah, I guess I'd be dying to answer that question, because that really flies in the face of the trophic realities of a real economy. In fact, we would call that the argument that you could have perpetual growth by unhitching the material impact by having an ever higher ratio of services to goods. We would call that the self-sufficient services fallacy. And we would base our counter-argument on the fact that every real economy has a trophic structure, the base of which is the agricultural and extractive sectors that free the hands for the division of labor unto the service sectors. And once again, then you would have to ask yourself what the services are being used for, and if they're not going to be marketable for things like ag and manufacturing and heavy service sectors like transportation, well, they're not going to be relevant to the issue of whether or not you have GDP growth. So I'm afraid that that's not an approach to sustainability, is to try to pursue more and more services. In about 3 weeks, I'm going to Kenya to give a talk on sustainable tourism. And this will be the key point there as well. You don't want to burst any bubbles in a developing ecotourism sector in places like Kenya, but they need to be aware of the reality that that money is coming from sectors lower in the trophic levels that are generating the money to get people onto planes to fly to Kenya for the ecotourism. And that's one of the most vulnerable positions to be in, is depending upon that income as, the real economy reaches its limits.
G'day, just one comment. In a sense, we've done that experiment over the last 50 years in Australia. We've become a service economy. The traditional productive sectors of agriculture, forestry, fishing and mining today employ about 5% of the workforce. More people work in restaurants, cafes and fast food places than in all of those primary producing sectors put together. Yet we have the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita of any developed country because of the way the few people who are employed in those productive areas use natural resources. So it's not, I agree with Brian, it's not a silver bullet to move to a service economy. We've done that, and that hasn't really worked.
Okay. Please. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question that brings two concepts together. Earlier today we talked about zero growth population, and indeed the models in a bubble suggest zero population growth. But in terms of redistributing the wealth and resources that you just mentioned, Professor, how consistent is that with Australia or Canada for that matter? Are we able to deliver a global sustainable model without opening our borders and letting people live in this space that we have that has a lot of resources and already existing infrastructure that the rest of the world can use?
Well, if I were Prime Minister, what we would be doing would be making a huge increase in our investment in international aid, because I think the best way to have a decent lifestyle for people in poor parts of the world is not to say, come here, given that our total population is less than the annual growth in the Indian population, for example. The reason people crowd onto leaky boats and brave shark-infested waters is because of the desperate situation where they are. And if we don't want them to do that, we should be doing something to ameliorate the desperate situation where they are. And if you think it's not practical for aid from the developed world to ease poverty, the UN Development Programme did a calculation about 10 years ago what it would cost to give every human on Earth clean drinking water, adequate nutrition, reasonable shelter, basic health care and education, including reproductive advice for women. They concluded it would cost a huge sum of money, trillions of dollars, which they then observed was about 5% of the global military budget. Yeah. So, for example, if we weren't preparing to spend 400 million bombing the crap out of some sandhill in Syria or Iraq, we could spend 400 million making several thousand communities self-sufficient in the poorer parts of our neighbourhood. And that's the sort of international aid I'd rather we were part of, the coalition of the willing to give people a better life, rather than the coalition of the willing to bomb the crap out of some sandhill.
We might have time for two more. Phil and then Shan.
Yes, I wanted to refer to the last model, to Graham Turner's model, where he talked about reducing consumption by 50%. And I don't think that's such a big ask myself, and I think it's really... Microphone? I think it's really problematic that we don't have a proper look at ourselves and start talking amongst our fellow human beings, particularly in the wealthy countries of the world, because the top 20% wealthy in the world consume, depending on what analyses you look at, between 10 and 30 times as much per capita as the rest of the planet. Now that's downright greedy, but it's particularly wasteful. So if we talk in terms of just minimising or reducing our waste, and that can be a stepped process, We could easily halve our per capita consumption in the rich nations and make an enormous impact. It's very saleable, particularly when you also consider that for the GDP per capita that we live on, we're actually on the levelling slide in terms of happiness. So we could be just as happy, probably happier, in terms of reducing our workload, spending more time, as was put before, with our family and friends. What's wrong with that? And why don't we sell it better?
Okay, well, thank you very much to the panellists.